Hi, I'm Steve Palumbi, and this is lecture 6 in the Science of the Extreme Life of the Sea. Today, we're going to talk about a kind of set of organisms that have lived for millions or hundreds of millions of years through the fossil record, and they look the same no matter where you are in their history, from hundreds of millions of years ago till today. They've got the same body plan over all this period of time. They probably live in exactly the same sort of way. It doesn't mean the species are the same, but the body plan and the lifestyle is. So I want to start with horseshoe crabs. This is a fossil horseshoe crab from 445 million years ago, and this is a modern horseshoe crab shown by comparison. Now, this is a little difficult to see. It's a very similar body shape there. I'm going to switch to one that's a couple hundred million years younger. This one's 150 million years old, and you can see the strong marked similarity in how these organisms are put together. Well, horseshoe crabs are arthropods. They're not crustaceans like other crabs. They are actually more related to the chelicerates. Modern day chelicerates are mostly represented by the spiders. This is a phylogenetic tree of the arthropods and then their related phyla, for example, the mollusks and the annelids. And this part of the phylogenetic tree up here includes the insects and the crabs. Down here are the the arachnids. And this is where horseshoe crabs would normally fit. They look like crabs, though. Why aren't they considered to be crabs? It's because a number of different subtle changes or subtle differences between them and crustaceans. For example, the leg number and their arrangement, and their feeding appendages, which are claws called chelicerae, that they share with other chelicerates, for example, the spiders. They also have a number of really unique features that aren't seen in any other kinds of arthropods now, like, for example, the book gills. So imagine you take a horseshoe crab, you turn it upside down. It looks like this upside down with its legs, with their chelicera sitting out there. And then below that are a set of plates that move back and forth. Those are the book gills. Well, those plates are actually very, very thin shell, very thin chitin, and they're full of the blood of the horseshoe crab. The blood moves through those book gills, and the animal moves them back and forth. You can see some of those the book gills there, and that's how the blood gets oxygenated by the water moving across those book gills. And it's a unique feature of these organisms that unites them taxonomically within the arthropods. Well, the lifestyle of the horseshoe crabs looks like it was pretty much similar from time to time across these 400 million years or so. But that doesn't mean the species are the same. We do know from the fossil record that there were consistently species of horseshoe crab there, but they never really diversified into a large number of different types, not like the trilobites, for example, that had all those different wild appendages and all those different sizes and all those different ways of living. The horseshoe crabs just stayed in one kind of ecological niche with one kind of morphology. So they persisted without a lot of morphological change, and they persisted without a lot of diversification either. Interestingly, modern species, of which there are 4, have about the same level of genetic diversity as you would expect from other kinds of shallow water arthropods living in those similar environments. So it doesn't look like there's anything odd genetically about them. But something about their body plan, something about their evolutionary trajectory has kept them static and without diversifying over time. Other kinds of living fossils we've talked about a little bit before are the ammonoids and nautiloids. This is a ammonoid from the Cretaceous period. This is a living nautiloid, Nautilus. They have the same coiled shell. They have the same chambers within it, and presumably had the same kind of soft parts, although we don't have any of the fossil record of the soft parts that are there. Probably one of my favorite living fossils actually is the fish, the coelacanth. This is a photo of a coelacanth, so you know that it's a living critter. But for a long time, the only record we had of coelacanths were in fossils. Coelacanths are early fish. They basically diverged off the lineage of modern fish early on. So this is a phylogenetic tree of the chordates with the tunicates, the urochordates, and the lanceolates, and the 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 agnatha. So, for example, hagfish here. The placoderms, those early um, bony fish that died out in the Devonian, diverged there. Sharks and rays diverged about 420 million years ago. And then we have this large group of the bony fish and the finned fish. Well, coelacanth lineage diverged back there. Instead of having fins like most fin fish do now, they're called lobed fin fish because of the way their fins have large fleshy lobes at the base of them. So a early fossil of coelacanth looks like this, and then the living specimens look like this. Very, very similar in shape and morphology. They are fairly rare animals. They live in deep water ocean zones, mostly in the Indian Ocean. And for many years, they were really only known as fossils. No living examples had been seen by anyone until about 1938, when Marjorie Latimer discovered one from a fishing boat in South Africa. She was working in South Africa at the time and would go down to the fishing boats just to look to see what they had brought in. She was a fish biologist, and the fishing boats brought in this Latimeria, which is the genus name now of the coelacanth. And she immediately recognized it as being A, something really different than what they usually got on these fishing boats, but B, something that was only known from the fossil record. So she immediately got that specimen, began to study it, brought it to Europe, and changed the way people thought about at least this part of the history of the early diversification of fish, because this was a representative of one of the earliest cousins of all modern fish. Well, since then, they have been discovered in a number of other places. For example, these deep sea habitats off of South Africa. But every once in a while, they have continued to pop up in places that are a little bit unusual. For example, in fish markets in Indonesia, where a whole other set of species was discovered a couple of decades ago. Similar to the way Latimer found hers, fish biologists just happening upon it in a fish market and knowing that that was a very strange and wonderful creature. Well, those kinds of living fossils end up being sort of singular types of organisms, a couple of different genera, a couple of species, very morphologically the same over time. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time teeing up the dynamics of not a single type of species, but an ecosystem, and talk a little bit about the ebb and flow of coral reefs over time. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in later lectures, but I want to set the stage for the fossil history of reefs over time, and then what it might tell us about today's reef crisis. So there have been different kinds of organisms that have made reefs over time, and they have been a consistent part of the ecology of the early ecosystems of the world. The early Silurian, for example, and the end of the Ordovician is when we first saw large reefs in tropical areas all over the world. And yet those reefs collapsed at the end of the Ordovician. There was another collapse at the end of the Devonian, and that mass extinction. And then at the end of the Permian, after that mass extinction, we see the beginning of the evolution of the modern type of coral reefs. Modern coral reefs are made from a cnidarian group called the Scleractinia. They have a relationship with the internal algae that is their symbiont partner, and they began to grow and diversify about 250 million years ago. Those reefs became quite abundant, but collapsed at the end of the Triassic. They grew up again in the Jurassic. They collapsed at the end of the Cretaceous at the the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. And they began to then diversify again over the last 20 or 30 or 40 million years. The last major kind of crisis that modern reefs faced was right here in time. It's called the PETM, the Paleocene Eocene Thermal Maximum, and that's where conditions actually were very, very inhospitable to modern coral reefs. At that time, temperatures had gone up, CO2 levels had gone up, so these organisms were faced with a double whammy of heat and ocean acidification, just like climate change is beginning to do now. What that meant was a collapse of the number of species and genera of corals and collapse of coral reefs as ecosystems, but individual corals still persisted, not growing reefs, but individually persisting and growing in different parts of the modern ocean. Diversity was maintained at the level of families, although diversity at the level of species dropped. Well, after the PETM, coral reefs began to recover. And we can look at that graph here, the early Eocene, till now, the generic richness, the number of coral genera over time, and we can also look at the species richness. And you can see that there were gradual increases in both the number of genera and species, but it took millions of years for those to come back. In fact, about 20 million years for the number of species and their abundance to begin to grow back after the PETM reef crisis. Well, just teeing up something we're going to talk a little about later, right now there's a current crisis that's very similar to the PETM. We have a warming ocean because of CO2 in the atmosphere, capturing heat and warming up not only the oceans but the land. We have sea level rise because of the extra volume of warmer water in the oceans, plus ice melt from ice sheets. There's changes in storm patterns. In particular, storms are becoming larger and more energetic. They're also becoming slower. So whenever they hit an area, they spend more time damaging it. We have changes in precipitation, altered currents, and then ocean acidification, where the CO2 in the atmosphere dissolves in the water, makes carbonic acid. That reduces the pH and makes organisms in the ocean have a harder time making shells. All of those together are the sorts of environmental changes that happened during the PETM and led to the latest coral reef crisis. Our coral reef crisis today is going on, and this is just a glimpse of it. This is a set of diagrams that shows bleaching events that happen on the Great Barrier Reef. Bleaching is where warm water hits corals, they spit out their symbiotic algae, they turn clear and white, which is why it's called bleaching, and many of them die because that alga, those symbionts, were an important part of their food supply. 1998 was a global bleaching event, and you can see in the Great Barrier Reef a large amount of coral bleaching that happened there. 2002, another global bleaching event. 2016 and 15 and 16 was a double whammy global bleaching event all over the world, and you can see the incredible amount of red here means the large number of bleached reefs that occurred on the Great Barrier Reef during this period of time. Well, all of this adds up to the beginnings of ecological change on reefs that might be about the same as happened in the PETM. And what we'll talk about in subsequent lectures are efforts that people are putting in now to try to understand what's causing this, what might be done about it, what species might be able to survive these, and then how interventions in ecosystems might save some coral reef ecosystems through this current crisis.